Assalamu. Excellencies, honored guests, fellow delegates, thank you for coming and gracing this summit. For those of you who were expecting Riaz to speak, our CEO, I'll try to minimize your disappointment. But it was only yesterday that I learned that I'll be standing in for him. And he said it's a summit about the future, so you shouldn't have any problem talking about this. And I was reminded of the words of the famous American coach Yogi Berra, who said, predicting is hard, especially about the future. But the challenges that we have in thinking about the future is that we now live in exponential times. When the radio came out, it took over 50 years to get to 50 million users. When the television came out, it took about 13 years to get to 50 million users. When Facebook came out, it took less than 2 years to get to 50 million users. When Twitter came, it was less than a year to get to 50 million users. So we live in exponential times. And it's very hard for the human brain to process what living in exponential times mean. For the longest time, for the vast majority of our history, we were hunter-gatherers. Written civilization is around 5,000 years old. So we're living now in an era where the human brain was not designed to comprehend the pace of change. And the only way I can communicate to you what's going on is from your experiences in life and by telling you 3 stories. And those 3 stories about 3 different industries that are going to undergo profound disruption in the decade to come. And the 3 stories I'll pick are some that will resonate with you, some more than others. One is to do with transportation, one is to do with healthcare, and one is to do with manufacturing. Now, many of you, I'm sure, understand what Uber and Careem have done to the world of transportation. We are going from buying cars to using transportation as a service. And that is a profound shift. But what will truly change this industry over the course of the next decade is when driverless vehicles become a reality. You already see them in the West, you see them in China. And it's interesting that you have these 2 counterpoints to do it. In the West, it is an imperative that was driven largely by one company. Tesla wrote this, and others have had to follow suit given its great success. In China, it was driven by a very, very fundamental problem. Their roads are clogged. They have built the largest road network in history, and their roads are still clogged. The only way to address that is not build more roads because they've got nowhere to go, is to have less vehicles on the road, which leads to driverless cars. Because if you have a driverless car, then you don't need multiple cars. The same car will go in the morning and drop the kids to school, it'll drop you to work, it'll take your wife wherever she wants to go, or if you different places of work, and it will run errands all the time. And while it's not working for you, it could work for other people. On a 10-year timeline, this is completely disruptive. Because other than the insurance industry, where what happens when a driverless car has an accident, this has implications about the total number of cars on the road. Today, the automobile industry is one of the largest heavy industries in the world. The automotive industry is one of the largest heavy industries in the world. It's pervasive, it's all over the world, we all own cars, we like owning cars. But in the US, the current generation of millennials, this is the first time that the number of driving licenses held by 16-year-old is in decline. Because this is a generation that hasn't learned to drive. They take Uber and they take Lyft and they don't feel the need to drive. What happens a decade out when the tipping point is overcome potentially in the next 4 or 5 years when driverless cars becomes a reality. What happens to this industry that employs millions of people in its value chain and provides us all with transportation? When transportation truly becomes a service and the idea of car ownership goes away. I don't have the answers. I'm just going to raise questions. So the second story is about healthcare. And there is a joint study that's happening in Boston as we speak. Harvard Medical School, Mass General, Brigham Young, 3 of the world's top hospitals, have pooled in all their MRI records. And they have, GE is also part of this, and machine learning software has been written that has gone through millions and millions of MRI results that have come from these 3 top hospitals. And what that machine is told is learn. Cancer, no cancer. Heart disease, no heart disease. Lung cancer, no cancer. And it has gone through, in the course of 3 months or millions and millions of medical records. Now, to become a radiologist in the US takes about 11 years. 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, 2 years of internship, another 2 or 3 of specialization. And that's when you're a radiologist. Another 10 years to really make your mark in the field. But this code, and that's all it is software code that was written, now has 96% accuracy when you give it an MRI. There isn't a doctor in the world who has credentials like that. What does that mean for the medical diagnostic community? Personally, if you have kids who are going to medical school, tell them radiology maybe not such a good idea. But that is a profound change in medicine where a particular discipline is being completely disruptive. You have better outcomes from a machine than you get from human beings who would have 2 decades of education and experience in their field. So the third story is manufacturing. If any of you know about 3D printing, today these are more hobbyist printers which can print little plastic gizmos based on a design you feed in. It'll give you an exact replica. That technology has advanced, and now you're having sintered metal and ceramics come through a printer. Essentially, any design that you want, you put in the machine, it replicates that product for you in 3 dimensions. And it takes right now a metal component about the size of a football, depending on the kind of machine you have, 6 to 8 hours. These machines right now are about the size of, twice the size of this podium, and cost a few $100,000. The metal and ceramic ones. These costs are only going down. They're getting better and better, and some of these products are now having the same characteristics as heat-treated steels and specialist alloys. There is an entire multi-billion-dollar industry in the world for spare parts for equipment. And there is a value chain of those spare parts of logistics. So if you own a German car, most of the parts are made in a factory in Germany and then shipped to warehouses all over the world. And from there they go to distribution houses, and that's where, if you need a spare part replaced, that's where your spare part comes from. Imagine if there were a bunch of these printers all over the world. Now you don't need the factory anymore. You put in the design, few hours later, out comes the part like fresh buns from an oven, and it will go into your vehicle. And that happens across industries. The entire spare parts market goes from being a supply chain that is global to a completely local enterprise. 3 industries, all multi-billion-dollar industries, all that will be completely disruptive over the next decade. Whether it's 5 years from now, 7 years from now, who knows? But you know that on the other side, they look completely different from what they do today. So what does this mean? Does the world recognize this? Because these stories, if you think about them, they have very profound implications. Now, I've spent half my life as an engineer and the other half as a markets guy. So I've had the benefit of those two perspectives. And these were largely, in some ways, engineering stories. So what's happened on the market side of things? In 1985, 17% of the S&P 500 was, the value of the entire S&P 500 was in intangible value, which is brands, intellectual property. The remainder was all hard goods and capex, factories, capital equipment, spare parts, inventory. That's where the value was. In 2015, 84% of the S&P 500 value is in intellectual property. Those hard assets, machinery, capital goods, etc., drives less than 15% of the value of the largest market cap market in the world. So these stories that we talk about, the markets have already recognized the value. The value is in your brands, is in your intellectual property, is in what you can do with data and information. So what does that mean for a company like Engro? So while we would like to pride ourselves as being an innovative company, and that has been Engro's track record. We were the first fertilizer company, we were the first chemicals terminal, we were the first polyvinyl chloride manufacturing facility, we were the first LNG terminal, we were the first open pit commercial mine with mine mouth power plants in Pakistan in Thar. It is, mashallah, a long and honored legacy. But the pace of change gets faster and faster. And the truth of the matter is, for large companies, less than 1/3 of their efforts of digitalization ever succeed. So you've got a 66+% chance of failure on digitalization efforts. That's the statistics out there. And why is that? That's because companies evolve to reward success and measure success based on what their historical success was. But as we like to say internally, what got us here doesn't get us there. We need to have entirely different lenses for looking at the future. Now, some great academic work has been done in this regard. Clay Christensen, a professor at the Harvard Business School, has written a seminal piece in this called The Innovator's Dilemma. And that chronicles case study after case study after case study on how big companies fail to innovate and a small upstart who they ignored for the longest time destroyed their profit pool and then took leadership in their industry. And the reason that happens is because big companies evolve with a certain set of metrics around success. And if a small business does not meet those metrics, it doesn't get the resources it needs. And one of the most talked about case studies in this is the Netflix Blockbuster story. So Blockbuster was this nationwide chain that first distributed VHS tapes, and then when DVDs it was DVDs, where you would go rent out the DVD and watch a movie. Along came Netflix, which was this tiny company in California, where you could go online, pick a movie, and they would mail you their DVD. And for the longest time, Netflix was a DVD mailing company. But slowly, when broadband penetration happened, They went online and built a business that eventually led to Blockbuster's demise. Now, in the popular version of this story, people like to paint the picture that Blockbuster didn't see this coming. That's not true. Blockbuster was a leading enterprise in its day. It had very smart people. They saw this coming. They tried to build their own online business. But guess what? It was a massively loss-making enterprise. And when you have a very large, profitable company and there's one division that keeps making losses, it was allowed to make losses for 2 years and then it was shut down. Netflix, on the other hand, has, for its first decade in existence, never made money because the cost of content and programming are so high that it keeps reinvesting whatever money it makes and was a negative profitability company for the longest time. And it could get away with that because it started with venture-backed funding. That's an entirely different business model. That's an entirely different capital structure. It's an entirely different shareholder base that allowed Netflix to burn cash for 10 years before it finally got to critical scale. You try and do that with a large listed enterprise, it is very difficult. Shareholders are not particularly forgiving. So what have we tried to do? So we try to learn from the innovator's dilemma, which is large companies aren't particularly good at handling innovation. Innovation requires a commitment, a mindset, a capital structure that is very different from what their mainstream business looks like. So within Engro, we created a small company that's called Engro Infinity. Engro Infinity will invest in much smaller businesses that are potentially at the startup or seed stage that have disruptive potential to affect our businesses. The first lens we're looking at is threats to our portfolio. Today within Engro Infinity, there is one small company which is called Engro Digital. This is an emerging enterprise which today looks at applying machine learning to running industrial scale plants like the ones we have for our fertilizer business, for our power plants, etc. It's a joint venture we have with GE, and they're making some great inroads because, as General Saab was pointing out, Pakistan has some outstanding talent. People who really understand machine learning and deep learning code and who can do that indigenously. And that's what that enterprise does. But the message that I want to leave you with is that innovation for big companies is very hard. Your capital structure is not designed for it. Your shareholder expectations are not designed for it. Your success metrics are not designed for it. But if we don't do it, somebody else will do it for us and make us irrelevant. So the hardest thing for any company to do is disrupt itself. And that's what we're attempting to do with the Engro Infinity initiative. Having said that, Pakistan just offers a huge runway for future growth. We share General Saab's optimism about Pakistan and the road ahead. CPEC is arguably the single largest game-changing investment paradigm for Pakistan. And if you see the CPEC logic, infrastructure and logistics is just the first phase. It's a means to an end. If you read all the CPEC papers, the original end game in there is for China to have an agri base to feed itself. So for those of you who haven't looked at this problem, China has 1 out of every 7 people on the planet is Chinese. They have access to less than 6% of the world's fresh water. They need to have a plan B to feed themselves, especially in the case of a strategic entanglement with any of the other powers on the planet. And therefore, Pakistan becomes very important for them. Not only as a part of the larger BRI initiative, but one, as a corridor for hydrocarbons from the Middle East, but two, and far more importantly, as a agri-base for China. Now, we happen to be an agricultural company. The green revolution that General Saab was talking about on how yields went up, we happen to be one of the prime players in doing that when we became the first urea manufacturer in this country, and that is what was a huge driver for driving yields up in the 70s and 80s, early part of the 80s in this country. We understand the agri value chain and we're a critical part of it. So we are incredibly optimistic about the role that we can play in this. And the biggest enabler of that role is something that is in all your pockets. It is your cell phone. Anyone who has an iPhone 6 or later has access to more computing power than the entire Apollo program and NASA ground control in 1969 that put a man on the moon. Millions of times more computing power. With broadband capability and essentially a supercomputer in your hands, which now is worth less than 10,000 rupees. You don't have to have an iPhone. There are very good substitutes. But in any event, with that kind of computing now widely available, the opportunity for us to not only disrupt our own value chains, but extract value that was completely locked in them before is unprecedented. And for us, that is the promise of the future. Thank you all for listening. Pakistan, Pandra.